Hello everyone, it's Dr. Stevens again with the second part of our lecture on the MLA documentation checklist. By the way, this picture here of the little hand in the big hand, I put it up there just because I like that picture and I thought you might like it too. But we have to look at something a little less attractive here, and that is this plain old checklist. All right, in the first part of this lecture we went over some of the basics of MLA documentation. I talked a little bit about what documentation is. It is a system for providing your reader with information about the sources that you are using, outside sources of information, ideas, and so on. We talked about the MLA system being a two-part system that has both the in-text citations, we call these parenthetical citations, in-text references, and the second part being the list of works cited, and you need both of those parts. And then we talked a little bit about what has to be documented. This is item 5 in your checklist, that you need to document anything that is taken from a source. And I pointed out the purpose of the checklist itself, that whenever you write a paper, before you turn that paper in, you should check the documentation in your paper against this checklist. So that's important. And I also noted that if you are looking for a copy of the documentation checklist in Blackboard, look under course materials, and you'll find a link to this very document that we are looking at here. Of course, the document you pull up won't have all this yellow highlighting on it. All right, let's continue then. When I ended part 1 of this lecture, we were talking about naming sources. Are your sources named correctly? And we looked at what the name of a source is. It's really, in effect, in a practical sense, it is simply the very first word that you see in a works cited list. Here's that works cited list again. So, for example, Davis then is the name of this particular source, and Garrett down here is the name of this source, which is an essay on Gloria Naylor, and so on. All right? Naming sources, and we said that the names in the works cited list must match those used in the in-text references, or the parenthetical citations we also call them. So, moving right along, we're going to go through the rest of the items in this checklist in the second part of the lecture. So, item number 4 then. Does your works cited list include all of the items that you reference in the paper? So if you make a reference to something in the text of your paper, you will use a parenthetical citation. If you make such a reference, then that particular source that you are referring to must be listed in the works cited list. So all of the items, and this is all of the items that you reference in the text of the paper. At the same time, your works cited list must not include sources that you do not cite in your text. A works cited list is a list of only those sources that you make reference to in your text. Do not include in the works cited sources that you do not refer to. Number 5 we've already gone over, so we'll skip to number 6. If you copy verbatim from a source, and check this, the copied words must be in quotation marks. What do we mean by a verbatim source? This simply means that the words on the page in your paper are copied word for word from the source. That is, they are the exact same words as in the source. Verbatim according to the word. All right? So those words must be in quotation marks, and they would be followed with a parenthetical citation. What does this mean? The citation alone is not enough. In other words, if you are quoting, oops, I lost my place there. If you are quoting something verbatim from a source, then you've got to put it in quotation marks. Otherwise, the reader is going to think it's a paraphrase. So the fact that you might have a parenthetical citation there is not adequate. So put your verbatim quotations in quotation marks, and then make sure that you include a parenthetical citation. Now, I don't know if this is elsewhere in the list, but this is a problem some people have, so let me mention it here. Be sure to include both opening and closing quotation marks. Sometimes I'll be reading a paper and I'll see an opening quotation mark, and I'll be reading the quotation, and I'll keep reading and reading and reading, and sooner or later I'll start wondering where that particular quotation ends, because there is no closing quotation mark. So make sure you use both. Item 7, use the same spacing throughout the works cited. We're talking about format here. The format of the works cited list is the same spacing as the text of the entire paper. And if you'll remember, because we've gone over this, there is a integrity lecture on MLA document. Well, I call it document format. It is also referred to as MLA manuscript style. All right, but what this means here is simply, what manuscript style here means is simply document format, same thing. This will be double spacing. It is a common mistake to single space the individual entries in the works cited list and double space between them. This is wrong. It is also wrong to single space the entire thing if you are, as you should be, presenting your paper in MLA document format or manuscript style. Use hanging indentation in your works cited. Hanging indentation. What is hanging indentation? It says right here, everything except the first line is indented, and it is the opposite of paragraph indentation. Let's look at that sample works cited list. This is hanging indentation here. What you are seeing right here. The first line is at the margin. All right. First line is way over here at the margin. Everything else is indented. It's the opposite of paragraph indentation, and it is the format that is used in the list of works cited to separate the individual entries so that we can see that Davis begins here, all right, on the left, and Davis continues until we get to the next thing that's on the left, and that is Diani. So that is what separates the entries. All right, hanging indentation. Everything is indented except the first line. Use alphabetical order. Alphabetical order. Do not use numbers. Okay, not many people do this, but occasionally, all right, occasionally I will find a works cited list that's numbered. No. We don't use numerical order in a works cited list. We use alphabetical order. Do not use numbers. Let me pause here then on item number 9 to remind you of how you are using this list. You are going through each item of this list before you turn your paper in, and you are comparing it with your paper. So, item number 9. You see this where Dr. Stevens has said, don't use numbers, all right? Don't use numbers. So you're going to see that, and then you're going to go back to your paper, you're going to look at your works cited list, and you're going to see whether you use numbers or not, right? And if you use numbers, you're going to erase those numbers, and you're going to put things in alphabetical order, as you see here. DA for Davis, DI for Diani, GA for Garrett, and so on. Okay, so we go D, G. Notice that everything here is in alphabetical order. 2 G's, 3 G's, a K, and an S, right? Alphabetical order, not numerical order. Number 10, parenthetical citations go inside the sentence. The period goes outside the parentheses. So, if, for example, I am using a parenthetical citation for this sentence here, the sentence that reads parenthetical citations go inside, it would go like this. And since I wrote this, we'll just put Stevens down here, all right? Stevens 2, all right? And that's what it would look like. So the period is right here, outside the parentheses. Very common mistake. Very common mistake to put the parenthetical citations outside the sentence rather than inside. There should be no punctuation inside parenthetical citations. Do not use a comma. This is just an example. There are lots of ways of violating this rule, believe me. But there should not be a comma between the name of the source and the page number. So you've got Ehrlich, comma 132. That's incorrect. You want to have Ehrlich 132 with nothing but a space between them. No punctuation inside parenthetical citations. Do not use abbreviations in parenthetical citations. You do want the page number, but you would not write something like Ehrlich PG 132. Why? Well, this is the correct way right here. Ehrlich 132 is correct. I'll keep scrolling back and forth. Sorry about that. Ehrlich 132 is correct, and the reason you don't use abbreviations or commas or anything like that is simply that the reader knows this is MLA documentation, and the number refers to the page number. So you don't need to indicate page by putting in P or PG or anything like that. Make sure that you include all necessary information in the works cited list. All right? Generally, this includes the author and title, that is, the author of the source, the title of the source, and the place, location, and date of publication. Now, please avoid this error. You must include, if it's an internet source, you must include the URL and the date that you, the writer, retrieved that particular page. That meaning web page, page on the internet. You must do that. But remember that URL is not the name of the source, and URL is not enough. You'd be surprised how many works cited lists use only the URL to list the source on the internet. A URL is not an author, not a title, not a place, location, date of publication. It is not sufficient information about the source. Item 14. In the works cited, be sure to use the format that is correct for the particular type of publication you are citing. Now, let me point out with regard to items 13 and 14 in the list that this particular lecture does not go into any detail on the actual format or information of different kinds of sources in the works cited list. You can go back to that handbook for writers of research papers that you see a picture of alongside this lecture to get detailed information about different sources, whether it's a book, magazine, newspaper, interview, and so on. All right? These sources each has its own format, its own type of information, and so on. But in general, all right, let's go back to 13. In general, you will be including author, title, and information about where and how that particular source is published. And by the way, since the internet is important here, the internet itself is, quote unquote, a location for a publication. That is, if you find a page on the internet, it is something that is published on the internet, which is one reason you include the URL. Item number 15. In the works cited, be sure to use the correct format for titles of works. Titles, you use a pair of quotation marks for short items like essays, and articles in magazines, poems, and so on, and you use underlining. Use underlining for longer works such as books. Now, notice that I have included here italics as an option. I probably should delete that, folks, not because italics is wrong necessarily, but because MLA indicates underlining. This is the old way of indicating the title of a book, and we're going to stick with that, even though it is also common practice in publishing to italicize titles of books. We'll just go with the MLA standard. If you go to the handbook for writers of research papers, that's what they would tell you to do, underline it. Internet sources. Be careful. Be careful with internet sources. The general principles for citing online sources are the same as for print sources. That means, again, that you give the author of what you find on the internet, you give the title of what you find on the internet, and so on. But there are some differences. And we've already mentioned this, the date that you retrieve your information from the net. Now, with a print source, such as a book, a magazine article, you do not, in the works cited, give the date that you read that particular print source. But the internet is constantly changing. The content of that book that was published, say, in 2004 that you read for your research paper and from which you quoted and so on, the content of that hard copy of that book is not going to change. But content of internet websites changes frequently. And that's the reason that the date that you retrieve the information is important. Just in case anybody is questioning it, in case somebody goes to that website and says, I can't find that information, well, it could be that that information was deleted, but it was there when you retrieved it. And again, please take note of this. The URL must be included, but you never list an internet source by its URL. That simply means the URL, the Uniform Resource Locator, is not the first thing in the entry in the works cited list. When you use, let me stop here, just in case there's still any question about this. All right? This is a URL. http://www. That is a URL. It is a necessary part of the listing of an internet source, but it would never go up here as the head word or the name of the source at the beginning of the entry in the works cited. And that's what we mean. That's the URL. It needs to be there, but it is never the first thing in the works cited list. Please remember that because it's a very common error. All right, now on to item 17. When you use a direct quotation from a source in the text of your paper, be sure to punctuate it correctly. Okay, we did that. We went over this. This is what I was talking about before. I wasn't sure whether I had an item on this. Common mistakes include the failure to close a quotation, right? Or the failure to place the parenthetical citation outside the quotation marks. Remember that we said the parenthetical citation goes inside the sentence, but it does not go inside the quotation. All right, the quotation is in the sentence, the parenthetical citation is in the sentence, but they are two separate things, punctuated separately. Now, a couple of long entries in the documentation checklist here because I felt that there was a need to explain these at some length. Information about sources in the text of your paper. Do not include unnecessary information when introducing a source in your paper. This might sound a little funny to you, but folks, I find this a lot. A common mistake is to waste words by giving the title and the author's full name, such as in this example, and this example is a very realistic one. Michael Ross wrote a book called Myths of Ancient Egypt in which he discusses the meaning of Egyptian myths. He writes that the myths, such as that of Isis and Osiris, are blah, blah, blah. All of this is unnecessary. All of this. The only thing you need is the name Ross. And this would be the way to introduce the source. If you want to introduce it with the information, to introduce the idea, if you want to use the name of the source to introduce it. And that's all you need, is Ross writes that myths, etc., etc. So, what's the reason for this? You don't need all of this business about Michael Ross writing a book called The Myths of Ancient Egypt and so on. Well, we know that he wrote the book because he's the name of the source. He's the author of the source. We know the title of the book because we can look that up in the list of works cited and so on. So don't include unnecessary information. Now, last item before we get to that list of works cited. Item 19, documentation of reference works. In the writing assignments in my courses, most people will use reference works at one time or another as a source of information. This is very, very common. Now, articles from reference works, such as dictionaries and encyclopedias, should be listed by the name of the article cited, meaning the name of the article that you are using as a source. So, if you refer to Encyclopedia Britannica article on mythology, you would not list that particular source under Encyclopedia Britannica. You would list it under mythology because mythology is the title of the article you are referring to. And we can see an example of this in the sample works cited list. Now, you've probably seen this enough already. Here's the example. Gender is the article in the Wikipedia that is the online encyclopedia that most of you are familiar with. This particular writer used that article on gender as a source, and so gender becomes the name of the source, the first thing listed in the work cited. The only time that you would use the name of the author would be in the case of an encyclopedia article, which is what we call a signed article. At the end of the article, say the article on gender, there is an author's name given. In that case, you would use the author's last name to list the source in the works cited list. Otherwise, it goes under the name of the article itself. Well, we've gone through the entire documentation checklist in 2 parts. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions about anything regarding MLA documentation, be sure to let me know, and the best way to let me know is to do so in a discussion question or comment so that others in your discussion group can benefit from my answer. See you online.